Thank you very much, Alistair. And thank you very much, everyone. I hope everyone's feeling nice and full and relaxed after a wonderful lunch. And it's a great pleasure for us to be here in Moscow with you to present today. So to get started, I think one of the important things about our presentation too is this collaboration. We're doing this joint presentation, and the way we work and have been working for many years in Australia is to actually work alongside educational researchers, educational consultants. And the way I like to put that in a way, I mean, I'm an architect, I'm a designer, good client, good brief, fantastic, get very excited and design wonderful things. But in some cases, working in education, it's very important to understand exactly what the educators, the children, what's really happening in the heart of the educational process. And so in some ways I call someone like Debbie our translator between what we design and what the real problems are, or the things to solve. So, so just a very quick bit of background. Australia, we're actually a very urban country. We live predominantly around the coast. There's essentially no one in most of the country. It's completely empty. Pretty much it's like living on Mars, I think, if you're in the middle of the country. There is an Indigenous community, but it's very much around the edges. Victoria, this is an area we're going to have a look at here, is a sort of a high density area of population, and that's just to put you into context there. So we're going to look at two case studies. One, this is actually Greater Melbourne. The city CBD is really just that little square there. That's our dense part of the city. The rest of this vast area, which I'm not exactly sure the scale, but it's possibly bigger than Moscow, is a sprawl of single houses that are sprawling out to the west. And this position up here is the site of one of 11 new schools that have been built in recent times. And on that particular site, we've also integrated an early learning centre as part of the school. And in the city CBD location we're going to look at, that's where we've taken a standard office building, the floor plate of a standard office building, and integrated an early learning centre into that office floor plate. So these two case studies we'll come to in a minute. Corrie Creek Primary School and Early Learning Centre, and Little Kids Office Tower fit out. But before that, I'll just hand over to Debbie, just to give you a little bit of background on, I guess, some of the pedagogical issues that we've been working with, and also some of the legislative sort of changes and challenges that are coming up in our country as well.
Early childhood education in Australia is currently undergoing some very significant reforms and changes, and much of that's actually being influenced by a lot of international research and evidence. And it was really interesting to hear Miho talk earlier today, because so much of that information has really guided a lot of the changes that are now taking place in Australia. So lots of national reform that's changing our whole landscape around early childhood education. In 2009, an early years learning framework was introduced, so it was the first time in Australia that we now have an early childhood curriculum, a national curriculum for all of our early childhood services. This year, the beginning of 2012, we now have a set of national regulations and a set of national quality standards. Prior to that, all of our states and territories had separate regulations. So part of what the government wanted to do was to create one set of national regulations that would enable all early childhood programs, all early years programs, to be consistent right across the country in all of the different states and territories. One of the other things that's been introduced over the next couple of years is universal access. What that means is that all children in kindergarten programs will have programs that are led by an early childhood educator, a qualified kindergarten teacher, that every child in the year before they go to school will actually have access to 15 hours of preschool, of kindergarten. So that's something the government is really moving towards and is part of all of these changes. That diagram there is a little bit of information around our new curriculum, and what it really describes are some of the principles, the practices, the vision, the learning outcomes that are all part of our new curriculum. And many of those things, I know you probably can't see the finer detail there, but they're very much the ideas, and some of that I'll talk about a bit more in the pedagogical principles, but very much a lot of the information that's been talked about earlier today, you'll see, is driving the practices in Australia around early childhood education. So these are some of the pedagogical principles that really are very much about what we do in Australia, and as I said, when you look through this list, you'll probably notice lots of similarities to what's been talked about earlier today. These principles define our curriculum, the way that we work with children and families, but what they also do is define how we create learning environments, how we design spaces for children, how we look at our existing environments, and obviously when we're creating new environments for children, the kinds of things that we're thinking about in terms of teaching, learning, curriculum for children. Just going through those principles very quickly, the first one is very much about agency, and that's children's agency, and it's really seeing children as being very capable, being very competent, being able to construct and co-construct their own learning within the learning spaces. We've already talked today a lot about play-based learning, and that's a very important part of early childhood programs in Australia, the importance of play in children's learning, and also the importance of relationships to children's learning as well. And that's a really significant component of how children learn. A very strong focus on learning environments, and as you'll see through the presentation, it's not only about the learning environments inside, but it's also about seeing the outdoor space, the outdoor playground as a significant space for children's learning as well. It's also about the role of the teacher, the educator, how they are being intentional in the way that they teach, the strategies that they're using to really build and support children's learning. As we've talked about earlier today too, it's very much about partnerships with family and community, how we engage our families and community, recognising the diversity of families and communities and what that actually brings to our early childhood programs and settings. It's also about looking at assessment, how we ensure that we are assessing children's learning and development in ways that are going to be really meaningful, but that are also going to help us improve our curriculum and pedagogy as well. And that links into our reflective practice, that that's a really important part of what we want educators to be able to do. Reflect on their work, reflect on their teaching, reflect on the curriculum, on the learning environment, so that once again, they're really improving the way that they're working with children and with families. Those two diagrams that you can see there, those photos up there, are actually about a play-based project in a kindergarten that actually involves many of those pedagogical principles. It was really about engaging the community, engaging families. You might be able to notice there that there was actually an architect that was involved. The real purpose of the project was actually around designing a sustainable playhouse. The community, architects, the children, the families were all engaged in the development of that, and it really shows how children were able to be part of that design process and how they were really very much constructing their own learning, but doing that in collaboration with many of the adults that were part of the learning environment, but also that were part of the wider community as well.
Thanks, Debbie. So if we just have a very quick look now at these two case studies as well. So this was one of, as I said, 11 new schools built as a part of a private-public partnership in Victoria, in Australia. And these schools comprise predominantly primary schools. But on this particular site, there was this idea to integrate an early learning centre. So basically, the gym, the primary school, the Early Learning Centre, and as well as part of this site, a partnership was developed to provide a community centre and swimming pool. So this was actually quite an interesting project, particularly given that it was a government site that actually brought together a whole lot of different facilities together on the one site. And I think very interestingly bringing the ELC, the Early Learning Centre, onto the primary school site. And this was really talking to the seamless sort of transitions going from ELC to primary school education as well. In some ways, it's a fairly simple sort of structure where we have an entry, a very open sort of community lobby space, two early learning centre areas, and these are divided by a kitchen space and the toilets and amenities, and you'll see that they are very flowing sort of spaces that actually allow a good transparency through the environment. There's also a community room, nursing areas, and various administration spaces and their amenities. These are quite budget projects. So it's important to note the sort of use of materials, which has been touched on a little bit, but essentially we're using block work or concrete block at low levels, metal cladding at higher levels where they're out of harm's way, and then using various other materials like coloured glass, for example, to provide a sense of excitement to the building. So inviting, dynamic, sort of welcoming entry, and there you're seeing some of those materials unfolding. But probably most importantly, we're really, in our collaboration, we're designing these spaces from the inside out and trying to understand what it is needs to be in these settings. And I think one of the most important things we're discovering is by subtle use of different floor finishes, by use of joinery, by the types of furniture that's being used, we're actually creating a variety of settings that can be adapted and transformed and changed throughout the day. And I guess in our climate we have this this opportunity for natural daylight and access to external play, which is just fantastic in terms of our climate. So a lot of our play actually happens outside, but in a sense is happening inside too in the different settings that we're creating. So that sense of flowing through to the external spaces, full height glazing to the external areas, and the sort of transparency across spaces. So here you actually can see through the different spaces, and this is actually allows for a sense of passive overviewing of the amenities area. So that may open up some interesting ideas and challenges as well. And here, even in the very early years, there's been a lot of discussion about where do the children sleep at their separate areas, and well, this is really just integrated into our designs, and these are used as teaching and learning spaces as much as they're used as rest areas as well. We have a lot of natural sun, and part of our challenges in our external learning environments is to actually provide shade cover over the play spaces, and the ratio of external play to the numbers of students actually drives the sort of these areas. I'll just pass over to Debbie again to talk about some of the challenges that we're facing.
Stephen's talked a little bit about urban settings. Obviously, some of the challenges for early childhood education is about geography. It's not just urban locations, it's also regional, rural and remote. As Stephen mentioned, while there's a lot of Australia that people aren't living in, there certainly are small communities in some of the very remote areas. So we have to really consider what that means for early childhood education, what that looks like in terms of design, what that also might look like in terms of curriculum, pedagogy and practice. Our climate too is very variable across the country, so we also have to consider what that means, and it certainly means that our learning environments are going to look different in different places and in different parts of the country. Because of all the changes and the reforms that are taking place in Australia at the moment, there are quite a few challenges just simply around now meeting the new regulations and legislative requirements, looking at the new expectations around quality and the importance of quality in early childhood education. That presents us with challenges around workforce, around how do we ensure that we have the most highly qualified educators, teachers working with our children in the learning environments. It also provides challenges around access. How do we make sure that all of our families have access to a range of early childhood services? And that's not just kindergarten, that also includes childcare, it includes after school care as well, so school age care. It's about affordability. There are issues around private and public, and as I think Miho mentioned earlier today, in Australia a lot of early childhood education is dominated by the private sector. So how do we ensure that we are still creating really good quality in early childhood education when there is such a big private sector. It's also about continuity. How do we make sure across all of our different early childhood services that there's continuity, and then moving into the future as children move into schools, how do we make sure that we have a seamless transition between early childhood education and children moving into schools? And one of the things that you will have noticed from what Stephen's been talking about is that idea of putting early childhood environments, learning spaces with the school and providing much more of an integrated approach, which is certainly something we've seen examples of earlier today. One of the challenges is definitely about managing change. We're experiencing a lot of change in early childhood education, and it is about how is that managed from a government level down to individual organisations, services, and right down to the actual educators and teachers themselves having to grapple with all the changes and what that means. It also provides challenges for our designers, for our architects, trying to make sure that they're incorporating all of the legislation, the regulations that are part of early childhood education, but also making sure that they're creating high quality learning environments for children.
So just one other quick case study, and this, as I mentioned, is in the centre of Melbourne, CBD. Melbourne CBD is full of basically office towers, and this site actually is on a mezzanine level of this tower building here. So it's basically an early learning centre that has been created within the floor plate of an existing office tower. And here you see this sort of courtyard environment. This is actually not early learning centre, this is actually some of the restaurants and things that actually take place. The early learning centre is actually back up on this space here, but just to put you in context of this site. So the challenge was, with an existing, the floor plate of this building actually is a bit bigger than this, but this shows you the main stumbling block, which was the core of the building. Here you see all the lifts and the toilets and all that sort of thing. So what we had to work with was this perimeter space that wraps around, and then up here was this sort of external deck area. So a challenging sort of environment to work in, and also to provide that external play area in proportion of the numbers of the students. So there's regulatory issues as well to deal with. But I'm just going to focus on this sort of little space here and how we managed to get away with some ideas. So here we're just looking inside the space, and what we're looking at here is a 3 to 4 year old sort of dedicated play and learning area. And you see all these glass walls sort of strategically placed around here. The next slide shows one pulled away. So this wall has now been pulled away, and this now opens up more of a joint play and learning area that is across the ages. So we're now starting to see a much more fluid, agile sort of space developing. And yet again, the next wall can be pulled out, and this is actually the glass wall that goes right away from the core. And this now makes it a much bigger space again, which is open for community and other uses. So just by having strategically located glass walls that can be changed within the space gives great flexibility to these environments. And you also notice the type of furniture, the type of joinery. There's been talk of having these sorts of storage units on wheels and that sort of thing, and they can be reconfigured to really create different settings within the space. And getting to the child scale, I think, is just wonderful when we start to look at some of the work we've seen today, and just being able to provide these nooks and interesting spaces that are really scaled to the child level. And of course, those external play areas. So this is the external deck area, and again, all of that glazing opens out onto this external deck space, and we now have I guess are protected from the sun, but also protected from overviewing from all the office buildings around as well. There's a sort of privacy issue that we had to deal with there as well. So this is how, in some ways, we're seeing that work-life balance. Both parents work in Australia. There needs to be childcare, and it's nice to have it near where you work. And this is actually something that's been developed. There's quite a few of these things starting to pop up in urban settings. But if I could just finish off too, into the, what's this transition though for this type of early learning centre design into primary schools? And the primary school and even beyond is changing as well. There's been discussions of corridors and the like. Well, we've pretty much done away with corridors in primary schools in Australia. They've now become sort of open, flexible learning areas. The teacher, it's hard to find the teacher in this space, but the idea of the, or the notion of the classroom, of the teacher at the front desk and the classroom itself is pretty much disappeared. And it's all about access to information, the teacher as the facilitator, students having specific settings that they can, that are appropriate for that task or that activity at the time. And again, I think furniture is a key component to that. So, but also this idea of flexibility in the sense of being able to slide back walls, natural daylight, the sense of view, all of these aspects go to make, I think, very flexible and enduring learning environments. That's essentially the end of that presentation, but I just wanted to also mention, I talked about the transition from early learning to primary. There's also the transition from primary, secondary, right through, but also to the workplace. And I just happened to pick up the Moscow Times this morning, which in English, and inside it there is a little magazine. And there's an article which is entitled Creating Offices for the Creative Class. And in this article, it's showing an office fit out one in Moscow and one in St. Petersburg, I think. And they're showing, you won't be able to see it from here, but there's these wonderful settings that actually look a little bit like what I've just been showing you, but these are for adults and these are the work environment. So in a sense, the young people, the young children and learners of today are going to working environments that they'll be quite different, is what I'm saying, and familiar to some of the images I've been showing you today. So thank you very much.